I think we live in a culture that's been somewhat really spoiled by sports. I'm a sports fan like other people, but everything works out to be some kind of competition in some way. Who's up, who's down, and all that. And I hate of thinking art in those terms. I have absolutely no desire to compare, I don't know, Carlos by Olivier Assayas with who knows what, The Social Network by, David Fincher. I mean, they're both remarkable films. Why do I have to compare them? What's the point? What would be the point of saying, well, I think David Fincher was a better director for that film than Olivier Assayas was for that film? These are nonsense calls. I don't think they mean anything. All they do is satisfy a certain kind of weird bloodlust that runs through our society for winners and losers. I like to think that the prize is getting into the New York Film Festival. Once you're in, everything's democratic, everything's equal. And over the years, in fact, many filmmakers have told me they appreciate the non-competitive nature of the festival, that it gives a very cool atmosphere. They can come, watch other people's films, meet other filmmakers without having that residual competitiveness as to who's going to win, who's not going to win, who has a better slot, who has a worse slot, all those kinds of things. So, just call it my own craziness in a way. I think that's a very damaging part of our culture nowadays, this competitiveness that we set up against all kinds of things that don't need to compete at all. The second question was about the gravitas?
Yeah. Taking over this festival that's been handled by these persons, and you can either break new ground or follow a very strong tradition that pre-exists.
Yeah. Well, I think, without getting into too many particulars, those who remember that far or care to will remember that the departure of Richard was very controversial. And I think the invitation of me to replace him was somewhat less controversial, but still, of course, was grounded with a lot of question marks. So I think I probably entered fairly cautiously and I love the festival. I mean, I was the festival's #1 fan. I'm a child of the New York Film Festival. I wouldn't be anywhere where I am today if it hadn't been for the New York Film Festival. Richard Roudney, Amos Vogel, those people are like my spiritual fathers, my artistic fathers in many ways. Even if you often disagree with your father or do different things than your father did, he's responsible for making you what you were, and that certainly is true in the case of Amos and Richard. Oh boy, that's a long one. Well, Amos Vogel was an immigrant from Austria. His family fled the Nazis in the late 1930s and came to the United States. He was involved in a number of activities, a lot of social and political activities, and then after the war became very interested in film and founded in 1947, I think it was, 47 or 48, a cinema club called Cinema 16, which was devoted to showing a lot of the new short works, many of them which were shot on 16 millimeter. And this became probably the most influential film club, certainly in New York and maybe in American history. Amos was wonderful at mixing programs. He would have on one program avant-garde shorts by Kenneth Anger or Gregory Markopoulos, documentary films, which he found interesting or challenging, as well as short films by directors ranging from Roman Polanski to Alain Resnais. So it just really depended how the mood struck him, and they had screenings every Saturday night at the old School of, what was it called? School of Garment Work or something like that, in the auditorium there. And he would have discussions and debates. Very often they would have the filmmakers. And there were several programs like this in New York at that time, but this was the most famous and I think the most influential because it did introduce so many new names, so many new talents. And I thought that eclectic mix of avant-garde, documentary, foreign was something that would certainly influence the style of the New York Film Festival. Cinema 16, I believe, ended in 1961 or 62, right around the time that Lincoln Center was opening its doors. Its first shows were run in 1962, and someone came up with the idea, I believe it was William Schuman, the first president of of Lincoln Center itself, that Lincoln Center needed some kind of representation for film. and the idea of a film festival came up. And that seemed like a good idea to everybody, or at least to a few people, not to everybody, I should say. And Amos was someone who had just ended his career at Cinema 16 and was kind of casting about for something to do. So the idea came up, well, perhaps we could bring this man to Lincoln Center to help us found some kind of film activity, specifically a festival. Meanwhile, on the other side, I think it was Richard Griffiths from the Museum of Modern Art told William Schuman that there was this American who had been living in London for a number of years named Richard Roud, and that Roud was the director of the London Film Festival, and that they should perhaps approach him as to whether or not he'd be interested. So they met with Roud, and Roud indeed was interested. I think the early idea was to make the New York and London festivals somewhat twins. London would be, after New York, but they would have similar programs or things like that. So anyway, if you look at the very first program of the New York Film Festival, you'll see Lincoln Center, the British Film Institute, and the Museum of Modern Art present the first New York Film Festival. That moniker, or that combination, only remained for the first New York Film Festival. After that, the other two partners dropped out. But Roud, enjoying his experience, decided to stay. He took on the title of festival director, and Amos took on, I think, the title of festival manager or something like that. In truth, they were equal partners. I think at first they got along very well, and like many people and very, very opinionated people in such positions, I think differences did emerge. They eventually worked out a rather complex system, as described to me once by Amos, whereby each of them would have a number of solo choices, and then there were a number of films both of them had to agree on. And, they worked it out in some way that would fill the festival. After, I think, about 4 years, the board of directors of the festival decided that it would be a good idea to have some kind of selection committee chosen from New York film critics, whatever, to work with the two festival directors. And that's how the committee system came along. Amos left after the 1968 New York Film Festival. Richard, of course, remained until 1987. I joined the festival in 1988. In many ways, I think that it was Amos who brought more of the focus on avant-garde work, American independent work. Richard was an American who had lived in Europe and I think was highly influenced by sort of the rise of European modernism, and was a great, great champion and great connoisseur of the work of the French New Wave and post-Italian neorealism and some of the new cinemas that were happening in different parts of Europe especially, but in a certain way I think was less open to perhaps the avant-garde and to other movements. And Richard, ran the festival until 1987. I think he had a very powerful vision. Not everyone would agree with every one of his choices or the directions he took the festival. I applaud the fact that he kept the festival small, which was, again, a great temptation to expand it. He fought against that in every way. I also applaud the fact that he decided never to institute prizes, another thing that I wholeheartedly agree with. And he showed the films, he and the committees that he selected chose the films that he thought were truly the most exciting, the most original, the most challenging. People have accused him at times of a Eurocentric bias, too oriented towards Europe. That might be, but it's a lot easier. It's easy to say that because I think people didn't have any idea how difficult it would have been, say, even in 1985, for Richard to have come up with a large selection of films from China or from Iran or from many other places. 5 or 10 years later, it would be no problem at all for me to see a huge number of those films, because first VHS and then DVD gave me access to those films. So I think Richard's choices were somewhat limited by what he was able to physically see. And that's why I think the festival had a certain Eurocentric bias. I think I entered somewhat cautiously and tried to sort of understand the festival. And the festival, like any institution, has its own ways. I think there are things that you learn. I would often see the process with committee members. people would come onto the festival committee gung-ho to do this, that, or the other thing. And within a year or two, they'd say, that's not really right for us. And I was always so impressed by the fact that they got it. They figured out, look, this festival can do this, but it can't do that. And let's just, continue to try and make it the best festival we can. And anyway, that's, I think, pretty much the way I approached it. I think probably the thing that impressed me most was one time I remember going to Joanne Koch, our executive director, when I began, and telling her that I really wanted to have some money to be able to offer foreign film critics, a chance to come to the New York Film Festival, as foreign critics are often invited to other festivals to write about it so that the festival has more of an international impact. And Joanne looked at me and said, but this isn't a festival for foreigners. This is a festival for New Yorkers. This is a festival for the people of New York. So it's nice to have foreign writers here, but we're not going to invite them. If they want to come, we'll do our best to make them feel welcome. But this is really a festival for the people of New York. And that was like a big light bulb in a way. I think at that point I realized, this is really the object of what we're trying to do. And, that's why I've never been involved in this whole thing about who showed what first, who has the American premiere, who has the world premiere. Sure, fine. I can't waste time and energy on such concerns. My concern is always putting the best festival possible together. And if that means that Toronto or Telluride or Montreal or someone has shown a film before we did, well, who cares, because New York wasn't at that festival. New York is here in New York, and if 400 or 500 people go to Toronto, or 300 to Montreal and 200 to Telluride, those are a lot of people, but we have 8 million left who can still enjoy our work.
Can you tell me about some of the difficulties, some of the challenges, some of the rewards, and if you have any sort of anecdotes about being the guy with the director in the wings, pre-screening, post-screenings?
I would think after 25 years here at the Film Society and 8 years prior to that at the Art Institute of Chicago, I think probably the one thing I feel confident about is that art will out. That is, art will eventually survive. So because of that, even when something is forgotten, attacked, whatever, if it really is good, eventually people will realize it. Let me give you an example. My third New York Film Festival, 1990, we opened with Miller's Crossing. And we saw the film very, very early on. I remember it must have been about April. And my colleagues and I liked it very much, and we immediately invited it for its world premiere at the New York Film Festival. And, everything was fine, everything's going. I remember we had the press screening, and it went okay. You had the feeling it was whatever. But then that Friday, Vincent Canby just tore it to pieces, just attacked, called it mundane and repetitious and, derivative, and went on and on and on about what a terrible film it was. But then to put icing on the cake, he then said, but you have to feel sorry for the New York Film Festival because they have to put on this opening night where all their not very smart but very rich donors come. So they have to show them something like this to keep them entertained. Something really insulting. So anyway, we're showing the film, and I would say 15 minutes into it, the people started leaving. And it was like we're in Avery Fisher Hall, 2,800 seats. I swear it was like a steady stream of just people leaving and leaving and leaving. And it was terrible. It was terrible for the Coen brothers. It's terrible for us. I just didn't get it. I thought the film was so terrific, as did my colleagues and a few other people who I really trusted. I couldn't believe we were that off. And I remember the party that night, people coming up to me and saying, what were you thinking? And all this type of stuff. Well, cut to the chase, 22 years later, 22 years later, I think it's regarded as one of their very best films. And I remember at the end of the 90s it appearing on quite a few best of the 90s lists. And in fact, I even heard from a personal story from a friend who was at that screening that night, and who was a friend of Vincent Canby's, and felt the same way, that it was a bad film. But then a few weeks later, because she's a working critic, she went to see the film again, and this time had a completely different experience of it, and really loved the film. And she told Vincent, I think you were really harsh on the film. I think you should see it again. And to his great, great credit, he did. and said to her, yeah, maybe I was a little harsh. Well, be that as it may, the next film by the Coen brothers got an unbelievably glowing review, over the top and whatever. And I like to think a little bit of that was penance for what he had done to Miller's Crossing. Now, again, what remains is the fact that Miller's Crossing is still with us. It's a great film. Most people that I know who like the Coen brothers think of it as one of their 2 or 3 very best films, and that's what I mean by art will out. And there are a lot of examples like this, I think, over the years. Sometimes we've been wrong, but I think very often we've been right in the long run.
What do you see as the possibilities and limits of engagé cinema, and what are the ultimate limits of a film?
Well, I mean, again, a complicated question. Obviously, I don't think anyone will tell you that it's A plus B equals C. It's not like, social problem plus activist films equals solution. That just doesn't happen. I think that what my job here is often consciousness raising. I think we do that by trying to show what the rest of the world might think or might look like, or the way that they might react to things. Again, let me give you a little anecdote. A few years ago, must be 2 or 3 years now already, when we were at one of our sort of cyclical moments of confrontation with Iran, I was talking to one of my students at Columbia, and we were just talking about things, and this came up, and he said, yeah, it's really horrible, this thing. I mean, when they talk about bombing Tehran, I keep thinking to myself, oh my God, does that mean they're going to bomb Kiarostami? And I was so touched by that this young American was really concerned that somehow if the U.S. launched a bombing raid on Tehran, that one of the victims could be Abbas Kiarostami. And it made me feel that through our work here and the work of other programmers who've supported Kiarostami and Iranian cinema, we've created an awareness of the humanity of those people, of their achievements, of their visions, so that this young American, in his way, cared about this guy. His work meant something to him. And so the idea of bombing Tehran was no longer some abstract notion that we're just going to drop a bunch of bombs on something that we'll see from an aerial view. It actually meant you're going to be killing people, potentially even a great artist. So I like to think of those as little victories in a way. If people walk away saying, gee, I now understand Turkey, or something about Turkey much more than I did before, or I now understand this, or I have a sense of the complexity of the issue, that to me is, I think, all we can do. I don't think we can affect direct change, but I think we can raise or expand consciousness.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic on that point than I probably should be. You certainly have far more experience in that. Looking at it from the other side, though, I mean, you're the guy who, and I don't know if it was 88 or 89, it was my first Singer Film Festival, brought Roger and me. Can you tell me about booking Roger and me and what that was like, and when you first saw that film, and what he's gone on to do now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I should say that, part of my own background is I went to graduate school at MIT, and one of my closest friends still is Ross McElwee, and the whole sort of MIT/Boston School of Documentary Filmmaking is something I grew up in, and something I still have a great deal of respect for. I mean, the whole school there. And in a way, so something like Michael Moore's film, I saw as the logical descendant of that tradition, which was already something that I supported very heavily. It was one of those things, I mean, Michael and I were laughing about it when he was here a couple of weeks ago. I often feel if only I had had a spare $5,000 at that point, I probably could have bought, world rights for the film or something like that. I mean, he was really desperate and just broke, and such a, he was obviously so sweet and earnest, and made this film, which all of us felt was an important statement about something that was happening. Of course, the horrible thing is it's much worse than he imagined it was going to ever turn out to be. So, I mean, we saw the film, we were happy to show it, and then suddenly we had this juggernaut on our hands, and, basically we rode with it, he rode with it. Since that, I think Michael's gone on to be an enormously important force in American filmmaking in general. I think that he represented an attitude that there are far more people who want to see films like this than we normally thought, that it expands beyond Berkeley and the Upper West Side of Manhattan and 3 or 4 other places around the country that these films can, in fact, find larger audiences. And he went out there and proved it. And so for that, everybody in the field owes Michael Moore an enormous debt of gratitude, because he really showed that with proper marketing and, of course, a certain kind of welcoming, accessible style, you could actually discuss very serious issues and reach hundreds of thousands of people, which in fact his films have.
But there's another sort of very small intelligentsia that are watching, and I've read that the Vatican had actually screened 2001 and told Kubrick, you're an agnostic who's got it right. So there are there are institutions who are watching very carefully what film does because they know of its impact. In selecting some of these films that you've chosen, have you ever had pushback from a government saying this Ugandan documentary, we'd rather not see it? And on the other side, have you ever had a country who's got an agenda saying, well, you know, we're really trying to get this trade agreement for Iceland, could you show this documentary, something like that?
Yeah.
How do you deal with, because you know, they know the impact films can have, even if it's debatable to some extent with a larger audience. Have you ever dealt with established intelligentsias, groups, governments in other countries being, you know, sort of
probably the biggest or the biggest example of that in my time, I think, was in 1995 when we decided we were going to open the festival with Shanghai Triad, the Zhang Yimou film. And everything was fine, everyone was really happy, you know, all was well. And then there was a documentary submitted to us by Richard Gordon and Karma Hinton, two well-known documentarists whose work focuses on China, called The Gate of Heavenly Peace. And this was a film about Tiananmen Square and and a lot of things that went on. And everything was good until one morning I got a phone call from somebody I knew at the Chinese consulate here in New York saying, by the way, we understand you're showing a film in the New York Film Festival. At this point, we hadn't even invited it, just been submitted to us, called The Gate of Heavenly Peace. And we want to tell you that you shouldn't show this film. This film is made by people who are ignorant of what went on. They weren't there. And we think it's a very harmful film. And you shouldn't show it because it's not a work of art and you're at a festival that shows art films or something like that. So, you know, I think at the time I didn't say anything or whatever. But, you know, we did decide to show the film. And at that point, the Chinese government told Zhang Yimou, we think it's best that you don't come or go to the New York Film Festival. And it became an international incident. I was photographed for Newsweek. I was in magazines all over the world about this kind of explosion between the two of us. Of course, nobody in the Chinese consulate, or indeed nobody in China, had seen the film. The film was being edited up in Boston. And actually, if they'd seen the film, they would have found that the film was a fairly judicious account of what went on. It wasn't, I mean, obviously it was pro the democracy movement, but actually detailed many of the mistakes that the pro-democracy movement made in terms of antagonizing the government. But that was one where, you know, we lost our opening night guest because of that. Nothing ever came of it subsequently. I've been to China a number of times. I've always been very welcomed. But, you know, here was a case where people were saying, no, you can't show that film because the film... no, it's okay. You can't show that film because that film is inaccurate. It really doesn't know what happened. So, you know, with that, all you can say is thanks, but no thanks, and take it from there. That's about the only time I think that's happened.
Well, fast forwarding on from 95 with Kurstami in the middle around 2001, just right into the present day, Asghar Farhadi, he went back to Iran and they canceled his official reception and all that.
Yeah.
Did you feel like sometimes you do something that happens for bad reasons? Do you know what the update is with that? Did they ever give a reason?
No, they don't have to give reasons. They're completely illogical, and you know it's gotten rather dull in a way. They're not. What can you say? They're just not very sharp people, and they don't have any ready answers. You know, if you're too popular in the West, that must mean there's something suspicious about your work, or you know, you're not dealing with people who have, I think, a very clear set of, you know, what would you say, outlooks on the world. Everything is reactive. So if you do well, that must mean this. If you do badly, that must mean that. And what can you say? I'm glad he's there. He's with his family. I know he has projects both in Iran and outside of Iran. I think he's looking forward to an immensely rich career, and we're looking forward to what he'll produce. But I think you can't really try and second guess Iranian officials. It's all pretty arbitrary.
You probably can't break it down by the decade, but can you talk about in your curatorial supervision in the past 25 years, what are some of the aesthetic currents that you've dealt with in your tenure?
Gosh, I guess you would talk about it in terms of a few national waves or whatever. I certainly came in sort of at the crest in a way, maybe, or whatever, the upward trend on Chinese cinema. Chinese understood as PRC, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong. The first New York Film Festival I worked on, which was 1988, I believe we had two Chinese films in it. We had Daughter of the Nile by Ho Xiaoshen, and we closed with Red Sorghum by Zhang Yimou. And then after that, for the next number of years, Chinese cinema was a really continuous presence. I think there may have been one or two of the 24 festivals I've done so far that haven't had a Chinese film, but that was certainly a major presence. But that kind of, again, that began in the mid-'80s, and by the mid-'90s, like any movement, it's not so much that it disappeared, it's just, to see another good film from Taiwan was no longer a surprise, it was kind of par for the course. So as that receded, I think the Iranians took over. And that was just when I was beginning. The first Iranian film we had in the festival was 1992, and Life Goes On by Abbas Kiarostami. And then after that, just about every year up until about 2000, I would say, had at least one Iranian film. Followed that, I would say, with waves from South Korea, Argentina, Israel. These were a little bit more consecutive in a way, and I think those have been some of the countries that have continued to really offer really exciting new films from, again, some places that had significant film traditions, others that were just kind of creating their traditions in a way. So those would be some of the waves. If anything, I think, though, cinema is less suited to that now because there's just so much of it. So, I mean, and you don't need a national cinema anymore to become an important figure in and of yourself. I mean, you can have, 2 or 3 really fine filmmakers in Chile, a couple of really fine filmmakers in Egypt, a number of West African filmmakers. They're not really dependent on a national movement.
I noticed that in your own program, you seem to have always brought in very accessible films along with some of the deepest, rarest stuff that no one's going to see otherwise but for some of your efforts. Again, have you seen cinema changing in the past 20, 25 years, art house cinema becoming more accessible? Is it rarer? What informs your sort of wider reaching picture?
Yeah. There are 2 ways of answering that. First, I've always thought or hoped I had a fairly eclectic taste and have enjoyed a wide range of films. I should also add, you can't discount the great importance of my selection committees, very often whom were people who impressed upon me and often convinced me how important especially some more commercial films might be. So that's, in a way, it's a kind of a team effort in that. But I think they felt similarly to me that if there was a big Hollywood film that we truly believed in, why not show it? It was something that we could very much get behind. We shouldn't penalize a film simply because it comes from a studio. The second part of that was, has art house cinema changed? I think art house audiences have changed. I think art house audiences have become quite conservative. I mean, I think that you look at the early 1960s. Let's look at L'Aventura, Leclis, Muriel, 2 or 3 things I know about her. Just go down the list of great art house films from that time. None of those films would get an opening today. I mean, no one would open those films. They're far too complicated, and people would say, I don't understand what's going on, and that would be it. So I think in the 1960s, you had audiences that were up for the challenge, that went to see films even if they didn't understand them and thought, okay, let me think about it, or let me talk to my friends or my wife or my boyfriend or my girlfriend or whatever about it and see if I can make some sense out of it. They like that sense of adventure. Not anymore. I think people are extremely hard and fast that this makes no sense. Boom, and that's it. They want everything to follow a Hollywood model, or what I think of as art cinema light, which is essentially just a Hollywood film with a couple of foreign shadings. You know, I think that's what people like most and think of as foreign cinema nowadays. So what's really changed, I think, has been the audience, which has become a very, very conservative audience.
It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Is it possible to recultivate sort of longer attention span and curiosity specifically by making films more available? Do you think the days of having a revival house in New York City are over? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I don't, you know, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I don't think film audiences are immune from the larger social political changes. The greatest time for art movies in the United States was really the 1960s. And of course, that's the era of Kennedy and Johnson. And, you know, for all the problems we can point to their administrations, this was a time where you could get money to go to college and study a foreign language. There was a kind of openness. We had a president whose wife at least spoke French. There was a much greater sense of openness, curiosity, of newness, of let's, you know, find something new. I mean, let alone the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay and lesbian rights movement, environmentalism, all of these things which came out of the 60s. It's no accident that there was, I think, a great time for art. You know, that all of that was reflected in a kind of openness and willingness of people to experiment, to open themselves up to new forms. You know, we followed that with years of, you know, mainly Republican and whatever rule, which I think has really closed down the American mind. I think now people are suspicious of the foreign, they're scared of it. People have turned even more inward in the United States. I had hoped that someone like President Obama, who of course lived abroad, studied abroad, and things like that, would bring a change. But I think for his own survival, he's really downplayed that. So in a way, we're living through a time when I think Americans are totally discouraged to embrace foreign anything. So because of that, we're more and more closed in ourselves, more and more closed in on our own models, more and more convinced of our own superiority at the box office and things like that.
People, like, they always imagine that you're on just Olympus and you're on the white rose and you're
Do they?
I mean, I imagine this. But what is the process like? Do you have any classic war stories about particularly impassioned debates and supportive films? What is the forum for selection? Dennis Lim's 3-year term is up and he's been replaced by Amy Tobin. Can you tell me what each member of the current panel brings to the...
You know, first of all, their wide-ranging knowledge of cinema. In the case of Melissa Anderson, I think Melissa has a tremendous sensitivity for documentaries. I've really always enjoyed her comments on docs when we've talked about them. I think she's very perceptive of documentary style. That's not all, of course, but I think of her as having a particular expertise in that. I think both Todd McCarthy and Scott Fondas, well, let me start with Todd. Todd, of course, is our LA guy, which doesn't mean that he's our Hollywood rep, but he's really got the sort of tune, the beat of Hollywood. He knows what's going on, he knows what films are out there, and he's got a very good populist sense, although he's someone who knows international cinema as well as anyone. Same goes for Scott Fondas, although I'd say with Scott, he has even a little more of a bent towards what you might think of as offbeat, you know, especially European film, strange, you know, for many people, French or Hungarian or whatever directors, and very, very open to sort of new currents in international cinema. Amy, you know, I've known for many years. This will be our first time working together. Amy brings, again, a huge range of experience. She writes eloquently about everything from Hollywood to avant-garde cinema. I'm hoping that, like Dennis, she'll bring a certain avant-garde sensibility and representation to the mix. I'm sure she will. But again, I don't find her lacking in any of the other areas. So I think it's a great team, and each of us has our strengths. And part of, I think, the process when it works is that we learn a lot from each other.
Any titles that you thought you had and you kind of lost?
My very first year at the festival in 1988, I remember I really wanted to show Dead Ringers, the Cronenberg film. And we were told by Fox that this was a commercial film and not an art film, and that, you know, it had no place in the New York Film Festival. And, you know, we were really shocked and tried to convince them and whatever, but they, you know, went their own way. Unfortunately, the film didn't do very well. And actually later, someone from Fox admitted to me we couldn't have hurt the film by putting it in the New York Film Festival. So So that was when I learned. I was a little shocked that we couldn't include Dead Ringers, which is still a film I love very much. A few years ago, we were extremely interested in The Fantastic Mr. Fox. And unfortunately, there was like some stipulation from the Roald Dahl estate that the film had to have its world premiere in London. And so because of that, since the London Film Festival was after us, we couldn't go ahead of it. So we weren't able to show that. That seemed to me a real loss. Again, these were things out of our hands. You know, really is nothing we could do.
What's one of your greatest triumphs in selecting films that you, or maybe something, I'm not putting you to toot your own horn, but a film that you thought, I like this film and it wanted to do particularly well and you're really proud of having made the selection. You mentioned those crossing as sort of reverse thing where you thought it was going to be worthwhile, people to get it, and eventually caught on. Any things that just taken off?
Well, I mean, a film that I love very much still, which again had a disastrous screening at Cannes, and we nonetheless backed it, and I think we did the right thing, was a film like Sweetie by Jane Campion, which I think is an incredible film, but it had really, I remember I was there, an absolutely disastrous screening at Cannes, and I think Jane was very, very grateful that we backed the film and, you know, pushed it into the fame and glory it eventually got. I was very pleased that we showed, for example, Satoshi Kon's Paprika a few years ago. I think, Satoshi, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, was a great, great artist. And I think we raised the level of kind of people's awareness of anime with that. You know, that we showed people that, you know, there are anime films out there that were absolutely the equal of the most complex narrative that, you know, anyone was making. So, you know, films like that you're really pleased that you do at a certain moment. I was pleased that we showed Beauty and the Beast. You know, I mean, I know at the time I got raked over the coals somewhat, but I still love Beauty and the Beast, and I thought it was a brilliant stroke on the part of Disney to offer it to us as a work in progress, and that was a magical evening.
You mentioned that you have a daughter who's perfectly happy to watch films on the computer. As a family man and as a film curator all this time, are you just a family curmudgeon as far as watching films? Can no one sit down with dad and watch a movie, or do you drop all your views and you watch stuff? How is it? What's it like? Is there such a thing as like a movie night in the household?
Really, my wife and I like to watch movies together, but I would say that my kids, not too much. They're also older now and off doing their own things. There was a very funny, I remember there was an afternoon a few years ago, I guess my daughter Lita must have been maybe about 10 or so, and we were sitting home and we had on the film by Val Lewton called The Seventh Victim, a wonderful film from 1945, which I like very, very much. And we were watching it, and for some reason, I don't know why, but at a certain moment I said to Lita, now you see this shot here? You see how those lines there with the window and the door? And I start sort of dissecting the shot for her. And, you know, and she was like, oh, yeah, great. And then later on, you know, when my wife came home, I remember she said, you know, oh, Mommy, Daddy was just showing us a film. There are all these lines in it. So I always thought that was kind of, you know, the end of my film tutoring of my children at that point.
I kind of take for granted that you have this whole other career as a professor, and presently as we speak, I think you've got the Columbia Film Festival. Any breakout scenes from your career there that you're proud to have seen done? I know with the Slant, and you saw that. And can you tell me, after the New York Film Festival, are you going to continue being a professor? Do you want to direct? Do you want to write a book?
Oh.
What are the things that you're feeling about?
Well, first of all, I will very much continue working at Columbia. In fact, I think we'll devote more time to the university. It's been great that I've been able to do both things, but I don't like to think I've shortchanged the university, but I would like to get more involved in things. And I think the university is at a moment when it's trying to expand its international profile, and I think I'd be potentially a good person to help them do that in different ways. So, I mean, there are various opportunities of things that I'm looking forward to doing at Columbia. Direct, right, no, I don't have an artistic bone in my body, so I have no danger of inflicting the world with anything like that. Yes, I'd like to write a lot more. I've never really had the chance to do as much writing as I would like to because of all the writing I have to do for the Film Society, so hopefully I'll be able to do some of that writing and translating.
Talk about just one more film that you selected on opening night that
Yeah, sure. Well, opening night is, I've often said, it's sort of the bane of my existence because, on the one hand, you don't want to choose something just for opening night. You want it to be something that fully qualifies to be in the New York Film Festival. On the other hand, it is a film that is situated before the biggest film party in New York of the year. It's also a screening that attracts a wide swath of our donors and supporters, whatever, many of whom are wonderful people, but not necessarily the most cinephilic people. That is, they're not necessarily people with what I would consider very adventurous taste in cinema. So you have to find something that qualifies or satisfies a lot of different aspects. I think a few times we've been enormously successful. A couple of years ago, I think The Social Network was an enormously successful opening night. It's a great film. For me, maybe the best American film of this millennium, or the last millennium, is 2010, so depending on how you look at it. A film that's topical, a film that's intelligent, that's beautifully made, just goes on and on and on. And it was a great night. You know, that was really one of the fondest memories that I will take with me from the festival.